Kate and Constance were 2 steps behind Sticky when he fell through the drapeweed. If he'd been the least bit further away, there would have been no saving him. Nor would Sticky have stood a chance had it been any other child lunging to grab him. As it was, with a desperate dive onto her belly, Kate barely managed to snatch Sticky's hand before it disappeared. Their troubles were far from over. Kate's dive to the ground had sent Constance tumbling over her shoulders. In a flash, she caught the girl's ankle before she too disappeared. But then, with the weight of her 2 catches, it began to drag Kate forward into the hole. Renee, Kate called through gritted teeth. Little help, please? Renee rushed over and grabbed Kate's legs. Hauling Sticky and Constance to safety was an arduous, tricky business, and an unpleasant one too, as Constance complained the whole time of Sticky's elbow in her ribs, but eventually Renee and Kate had dragged them back onto solid ground, where all 4 now lay on their backs looking up at the sky and panting from the exertion. Apparently drapeweed isn't perfectly harmless after all, Constance said. Sticky looked at her. He wanted to be irritated, but found that he was so relieved to be alive that he could only smile. In fact, it appears to be carnivorous, Kate said. Before long, they were all chuckling. The danger was past, and somehow the excitement had helped them shed a little of their anxiety. Glancing at one another with satisfied smiles, as if to say, "We did it, didn't we? Together we did it." They rose and dusted themselves off. They gathered near the hole in the drapeweed, though not too near the hole, to try to peer in. All they could see was darkness and trailing tendrils, and even those were slowly being covered up. The flexible stems and shoots thrust aside by Sticky's fall were stiffening and spreading back into place. Like a footprint in a spongy grass, the hole would soon disappear entirely. Kate crawled to the edge of the hole, pushed aside some tendrils, and shone her flashlight down into the darkness. "It's a pit, 20 feet deep." She glanced back at Sticky. "Deep enough to break your legs." Sticky swiped his forehead. "Thanks for the grab, Kate. I do like my legs." I would like to thank you too," said Constance, "except I wouldn't have fallen in the hole if you hadn't dived. So my thank you and your apology cancel each other out." Kate laughed. "Whatever, Constance, as long as I don't have to apologize, I suppose." The children stood by the drapeweed for some time, pondering their discovery. No one could think of any good reason for it to be there. Why had someone gone to the trouble of covering that dangerous hole? "There's only one answer I can think of," Renee said at last. "A trap," Kate said. Renee nodded. "Oh, goody," Constance said. "Now there are traps, too." "But why is it here?" Sticky wondered. "What is it for?" Kate snorted. "Really, Sticky? You amaze me. A trap is for catching things or people." Sticky didn't answer. He was tiptoeing back to the path, careful of every step. The children made it to their rooms almost exactly when the executives were supposed to come for them. It was probably a bad idea to keep executives waiting, Sticky had said. But it was they, not the executives, who waited. When half an hour had passed with no sign of Jilson, Constance suddenly sang out, "Now we have to wait 30 minutes to see some dirty executive. 30 long minutes I could have been sleeping. But she doesn't find her appointments worth keeping." Kate was startled. "What are you, a cuckoo clock poet?" "Cut it out. She might be right outside the door." Jilson was in fact right outside the door, but to Kate's relief, she entered with no more than her previous bossiness. No hint of indignation. The walls and doors must be very solid, Kate reflected. It would be difficult to eavesdrop through them. This could be to the children's advantages when they had secret discussions, but it would also make spying on others more difficult. In fact, a fact that irritated Kate, though not nearly as much as when Jilson said, "Hurry up now, Squirts, I can't wait on you all day." Kate bit her tongue. "We're ready." "You'd better be," said Jilson. Then her face clouded. "Hey, why isn't your television on? Is it broken?" We just turned it off just now," Kate lied. "Why would you do that?" Kate blinked. "Because we were leaving the room." "Oh," Jilson said again, considering. Finally she grunted. "Well, whatever floats your boat." They joined Jackson and the boys in the corridor. The executives had a sheet of paper with them now that listed the children's names, and after checking to be sure each child was accounted for, they still didn't bother with handshakes. They began the Institute tour. After a quick pass through the dormitory, nothing but student quarters and bathrooms, they walked outside where Jilson told them they were free to roam anywhere they wished as long as they kept to the paths. Too dangerous off the paths, she said. The island's covered with abandoned mine shafts. The children exchanged glances. They're from all the early days when Mr. Curtin built the Institute, Jilson explained. Before Mr. Curtin bought the island, people said there was nothing here but rocks. What they didn't know was what kind of rocks. Turns out the whole island was rich in precious metals. Mr. Curtin knew this. He built the bridge, brought in mining equipment and workers, a whole colony of workers. Their dormitory was the first building constructed. It's now the student dormitory. Like a proper tour guide, Jilson pointed to the student dormitory right in front of them, even though they knew where it was. Dutifully, the children looked and nodded. Mr. Curtin became one of the richest men in the world, Jilson went on with a proud smile. And you can guess how he used his wealth. Doubtful, Jackson murmured. He built the Institute, Renee offered. Jackson looked surprised. Exactly, said Jilson. A free school, as you know. Doesn't cost a dime to come here. All thanks to Mr. Curtin's generosity. He asks nothing in return, mind you. Not even attention. Mr. Curtin is every bit as reclusive as he is generous. Never leaves the Institute, never takes a vacation. Too much important work to do, he says, broadening the minds of the next generation. The executives led them across the rock garden onto the large central plaza where they lay fronted and flanked by the Institute's massive stone buildings. As they walked, Jackson identified the buildings in turn. Starting from the right, you can see your dorm, of course. You remember your dorm, don't you? And just to the left of it, the one with the tower, is the Institute's control building. It houses Mr. Curtin's office, the guard, and the recruiter quarters, and the executive suites. You'll never have reason to go there unless Mr. Curtin calls you to his office, or unless you become executives yourselves someday. Jackson looked at the children over his head and said he rather doubted that possibility. Anyway, he went on, next to the Institute control building, you'll see the cafeteria right in front of us here, and then the classroom building. That building set off to the side there is the Best of Health Center, which is where we call the infirmary. And the building way up on the path is the gym. The gym is always open except when it's closed. And there you have it. Those are all the institutional buildings. What about that one? Renee asked, pointing to a rooftop just visible over the classroom building. Jackson scowled. I was getting to that, Renard. That's the helpers' barracks. You know what barracks are, right? It's where the helpers live. Helpers? Do you not have eyes? Jackson scoffed. Haven't you seen the grown-ups in white uniforms scuttering about, sweeping walkways and picking up trash and whatnot? Renee nodded. He couldn't have known they were called helpers, of course, but he chose not to point this out. The helpers do the maintenance, Jilson explained, and the cleaning, the laundry, the cooking, all the unimportant tasks, you know. Now come along, squirts. Don't drag your feet. There's still lots to see inside. The executives bustled them into the classroom buildings, which seemed large enough from the outside, but was perfectly enormous within. Brightly lit corridors branched out from the entrance in all directions, with Constance struggling to keep up and looking very unhappy about it. The children were led down corridor after corridor. At last they stopped in one that was lined on both sides with classroom doors. Now, there are an awful lot of corridors in this building, said Jilson. And not just this building, Jackson put in. Some connect to the helpers' barracks and the cafeteria, which have their own corridors, obviously. Obviously, Jilson said. So the next thing you shrubs need to know is how to find your way around. Now don't fret, it seems confusing, but it isn't confusing, which happens to be an important principle you'll learn here at the Institute. It isn't confusing, said Constance, who was turning around and around perfectly confused. Look beneath your feet, Jackson said. See that stripe of yellow tiles? Just keep to the corridors with the yellow tiles on the floor and you can't get lost. Obediently, the children looked at the floor. Renee had noticed the yellow tiles but hadn't thought anything of them. He'd assumed they were decorative. He must remember not to assume anything about this place. Jilson put a finger to her lips and drew the children over to peek through a window of one of the doors. A gaggly executive stood in front of about 30 attentive young students, leading them in a memorization exercise. The free market must always be completely free. The free market must be controlled in certain cases. The free market must be free enough to control its freedom in certain cases. The free market must have enough control to free itself in certain cases. The free market... What on earth are they talking about? Sticky asked. Oh, that's just the free market drill, said Jackson. Very basic stuff. You'll pick it up in no time. Sounds like nonsense to me, said Constance. On a certain level, everything sounds like nonsense, doesn't it? Jilson said as they continued their tour. Precisely the kind of lesson you'll learn at the Institute. Take the word food, for example. Ask yourself, why do they call it that? It's an odd-sounding word, isn't it? Food? It could easily be considered nonsense, but in fact, it's an extremely important. It's the essential stuff of life. It still sounds like nonsense, Constance muttered, and now I'm hungry. It wasn't just this talk of food that made Constance's mouth water, and all the other children's too, for that matter, but the smell of food as well. They were being led to the cafeteria now, a huge, bright lit room, crowded with tables, much like any other cafeteria, except for the smells. Drifting in the air were what smelled to be 1,000 delectable scents: grilled hot dogs, hamburgers and vegetables, melted cheese, tomato sauce, garlic, sausage, French fried fish, baked pies, cinnamon and sugar, apple tarts, and so on. Beyond the empty tables on the other side of the counter, they saw helpers scurrying about the kitchen, half hidden behind clouds of steam and grill smoke. All right. Like and subscribe.